Hello, and welcome back to our Iliad analysis series. In this episode, we're going to be looking into a few motifs that appear throughout the book. While these elements aren't as central to the structure or unfolding of the book as the themes covered in the last episode, they are key ideas that might be missed by a more casual reader, and so elaborating on them should help enhance the reader's understanding of the Iliad as a whole. The aim here is to build enough of a bedrock of knowledge regarding these elements that we don't have to keep repeating ourselves in future episodes when we go piece by piece, chapter by chapter. As mentioned in previous episodes, some elements and recurring motifs might go over the reader's head somewhat if they don't understand much of the Iliad's cultural context, such as the first one that we're going to go over, armour. Far from merely serving a protective role, which is, of course, its most practical and direct purpose, armour in the ancient world served many other spiritual and psychological purposes alongside its primary function. This is often forgotten in the modern day, and for the masses, perhaps for some time, due to the nature of its procurement. In order to truly get across the sense of how differently armour was seen to the ancients and Homeric heroes, we need to first establish what armour is in current armies in order to have a point of reference. Excluding, momentarily, the currently unfolding Ukraine war, in the modern era body armour is issued. It consists of a type of vest, known quite creatively as a plate carrier, and inside there are two pieces of protective plates, one in the front, one in the back. The side plates that cover the waist can also be fitted, but many prefer to go without due to the added weight and cost, and these are, as far as I'm aware, not commonly issued to regular enlisted soldiers. A soldier has no choice in what weight or level of protection he wishes to have, no choice on the look, the colours, or camouflage of his plate carrier, nor anything else on his uniform, besides perhaps his boots, for which he needs to gain explicit approval. He cannot have his hair as he wishes, nor grow a beard if he so desires, at least for the most part. Everything is uniformed and standardized. He might, emphasis on might, get away with wearing what's known as a morale patch, typically something cool or funny that isn't connected to his unit, that's worn alongside flags, unit insignia, and other patches used to identify him and the group to which he belongs. In terms of his appearance, he is not in any way an individual, and everything from his head to toes has been issued and mandated for the sake of one practical and functional reason or another. This has been the case for virtually all armies who were issued their equipment. For the Roman legions, after the Marian reforms, soldiers were given a loan with which to purchase their armour and equipment, and would often buy them from veterans who were retiring or upgrading, at least in the case of the masses. They didn't necessarily have a concept of standard issue as we think of it, and there doesn't seem to have been any rules for hair length or facial hairstyles, as everything from neckbeards to mustaches, goatees and clean-shaven faces have been depicted in artwork of Roman legionaries and praetorians. So there was plenty of different ways that a soldier could still be very much an individual. Curiously enough, if the Roman poet Juvenal is correct, even during the 2nd century CE, the idea of long hair was seen as the mark of a manly warrior, something that must be earned, whereas a shaved head denoted effeminacy, perhaps due to the association with slaves. Still, soldiers in the ancient era, even in standard armies, were still more individual in terms of their equipment than soldiers today, with no standardized equipment as much as more commonly affordable kit. And that brings us to the Homeric concept of armour, which is an entirely different view that might seem quite alien to many. The armour, to the heroes, was a symbol of who they are. It was as personal to them as their very skin, something that defined who they were in the midst of battle. Armour was often inherited, passed down from generation to generation, either out of necessity, in the case of those with limited funds, or an ancestral inheritance to the nobility. And if passed down, then it had obviously done its job well enough previously. Imagine coming of age, preparing to go into battle, and your aging father handing you an ornate, polished, but battle-scarred piece of armour that has protected the warriors of your bloodline and kept them alive for generations. Now it will do the same for you. The spiritual power that it would give you, the connection to your ancestors before going off to war, not to mention the boost in morale, would be beyond belief for a modern man. Therefore, the armour was often a symbol of a man's attachment to his ancestors, as if they themselves are protecting him, and a display of a series of sons undefeated for generations. If the armour was entirely his own, then it was a symbol of his own individuality, glory and pride, and a promise of the legacy that he intended to create. Armour was not merely a protective tool, it was a personal symbol of the warrior himself, and one by which he could be more easily identified by his comrades, or his enemies. Much like the way in which shields throughout history have had different patterns used to identify men, figuring out friend from foe, or better recording his great deeds, a unique armour meant that heroes would stand out from the teeming masses of men hacking one another's limbs, soaked in sweat and gore, their faces often covered by their protection. Being able to point to a man with a specific crest fixed to his helm, or symbol emblazoned on his shield, or unique look of his armour would make his great and valorous deeds more easily attributed to him, as well as giving his subordinates a man around whom they could rally and follow. In my experience, some of that has come back into modern warfare, at least to some extent. Each man I know has, for example, a different plate carrier, and prefers a different form of camouflage. Some, like myself, grow their hair long, far, far longer than anything any other modern military would allow. Some grow beards, others mustaches, others keep a clean shave out of preference. Our armour is decorated in patches, some so brightly coloured as to be completely impractical, others outrageously offensive to most amongst the modern world. Even with our faces covered, my comrades could see a man with a Flecktarn helmet and know that it was me. I've been featured on the infamous Tracker Nazi Merc Telegram channel at least twice, and to know that my enemies know who I am, and were even discussing and theorising as to why I was wearing Flecktarn camouflage as an Englishman, does feel far more Homeric in character. We're individuals with our own call signs, our own armour and clothing, recognisable to our comrades even at a glance. Returning to the Iliad, we often see men, having already slain their opponents, risking their lives to strip their foe's corpse of its armour, often dying in the process themselves. Equally, we see men throwing themselves into a great peril, often also falling in the fray in order to prevent their enemies from stripping the body of a fallen friend. What material, practical reasons would they have for doing this? Do they plan on selling them for scrap after the war? Of course not. Rather, a hero's armour is a symbol of his own honour and prowess, and without taking it from him, one cannot say that they are the one who defeated him and took that glory for themselves. Friends and brothers, comrades in arms, on the other hand, see it as a piece of their friend or ally being taken, their legacy dishonoured. These were trophies men were seemingly happy to risk dying for, even after their combat had been won. Thus, clearly the armour must have been of great significance to an individual hero, his bloodline, and his honour. Two interesting examples we see of armour being used as a key plot or character point are in the cases of Hector's helm and Achilles' armour and shield, both sets of them. Last episode, we brought up the concept of epithets in the context of the gods, but heroes also have these epithets. Hector's most common and most defining one is Hector of the Shining Helm, or Gleaming Helm, depending on the translation. A lot of detail is given to this helmet, more than the appearance of Hector's actual face. We know that it gleams in the sunlight, almost blindingly bright, and that it has vast horsehair crests. The helmet itself is part of Hector's identity. After he has confronted and upbraided Paris in front of Helen, a fairly common occurrence, it seems as if Helen sees something far more attractive in Hector, a brave warrior, bold leader, and honest man. She seems to almost hint that she would rather be with him than his brother. Hector, presented with the advances of superficial beauty, merely glares at her in anger, as Homer turns the focus to his helmet. She is not allowed to see the man beneath the armor, his inner and emotional self, but is instead scolded and rejected by the champion of Troy. He then leaves to see his wife and baby boy, rejecting the superficial beauty and mindless pleasure, instead going to be with those who he truly and deeply loves. The only time Hector is said to remove his helmet, except towards the end of the book, which we will get into in a moment, is when he takes his boy in his arms. The tall and blindingly bright helmet scares his baby boy, and so Hector of the shining helm, without hesitation, throws off his helmet and takes his boy in his arms, reassuring him that it's only his father. Without an appreciation for armor and what it meant for warriors at the time, you can still appreciate this moment. But knowing that it's symbolic of a warrior and ceaseless slayer of men who fights with Ares himself at his back, a relentless and remorseless fighter, blood-soaked and brutal, being a true father, showing his true inner and emotional self to his baby boy, and only to his baby boy, is nothing short of beautiful. I've spoken about this moment in past episodes of Aristogenesis as one of my favourite moments in the Iliad, and it ties into the theme of fathers and sons we spoke about previously. It shows that Hector, as an embodiment of the Trojan people, truly cares for the future of his kin, his baby boy and the Trojan people as a whole. He does not fight for the sake of fighting, and though he seeks honour and glory in combat as all good men, his main motivation is to protect that which he loves. Another way in which the connection between armour and the individual personality of the warrior connect is in the example of Achilles. Achilles, as we have discussed previously in brief, bears a name that roughly translates to grief of the people or anguish of the people. His name is a combination of achos, from where we get the English word ache, and laos, meaning people, or according to some scholars, army. So essentially, take your pick. His name is either grief of the people, grief of the army, anguish of the people, etc., etc. From a narrative and poetic point, all of these translations have the same effect. Achilles himself is an embodiment of grief faced by soldiers, warriors, and civilians. When Patroclus bears his armour into battle, contrary to the film, Hector and many others immediately realise it's Patroclus wearing it, but it changes nothing. Patroclus has, by taking on the armour of Achilles, almost literally become him. By taking on this second skin rather than his own, he takes on Achilles' essence as a warrior, and he himself becomes grief. It is of course the grief of this death that sees Achilles return to the battlefield in order to confront Hector, he himself now wearing the armour of Achilles. Homer makes a deliberate point of how Hector removes his own helmet, the helmet that has, as we've discussed, defined his entire character up until this point, and replaces it with that of Achilles, grief. The poetic genius of this cannot be understated, but goes over the head of most modern readers. First of all, this duel is, in spirit, Achilles against himself. The warrior's greatest battle is within, it is self-mastery, which is why Athena, divine wisdom, is aiding him, not Ares, who lusts for blood and vengeance. Secondly, when Hector, having taken on the mantle of Achilles and been slain outside the walls of Troy, is killed, Achilles pierces his heel in order to drag his body around the city walls. Dressed as Achilles, having in some ways become him, his heel is pierced. It not only foreshadows Achilles' own death, but demonstrates that it was Achilles himself who decided upon it, who caused it to happen by choice. After all, his death is the result of him having chosen a short life in glory, rather than a long one that would be forgotten. And finally, it is Achilles confronting his own grief. Hector, after all, had slain Patroclus, and the grief that he himself has caused, when Priam comes to collect the body of his slain son. Achilles is taken aback by the old man, who reminds him of his own father, and looks at the corpse of one who had died in his own armour. He sees his own father in Priam, his own father's grief, and himself in Hector, whose fate he knows he will soon share. He sees the tragedy that his actions and choices will bring, and is confronted with the heartache and grief that his death will bring to his own father. Priam bravely confronting the grief of the loss of his son, rather than lashing out with anger and emotion at Achilles, or refusing to confront what has happened, is what disarms Achilles, disarming grief. And in the end, Hector and Patroclus, both men having died dressed as grief, are laid to rest side by side within the narrative, the Iliad ending their funerals. Moving on from what is surely a weighty and complex motif that I hope has expanded your appreciation for the subtle poetry and metanarratives at play in Homer's works, we now move on to cover a more direct and visual motif, that of the hero's hair colour. It's worthy of remembering that to the Greeks, and to ourselves if we're truly honest, outward appearance was taken as signs of inner traits. People can argue online constantly about Achilles and Menelaus being described as blonde, and how they believe it's not true, it's a Nordicist mistranslation, conspiracy, or others can argue that this is proof that they were actually Scandinavians, but both are missing the point. When specific hair colours are given for characters, it's meant to say something about them and their personality. It's a very visual and striking poetic device, which can be applied to a character's overall appearance in general. Evidence of this is in Hector being specifically referred to as dark-haired. We can assume that in ancient Anatolia, dark hair was very common, so specifying him as such must serve some other purpose. Hector's dark hair is meant to convey a mature, grim seriousness and awareness of the conflict. He is not young and beautiful like his brother Paris, or swayed by emotion like his greatest rival Achilles. He's grounded and more than willing to end up blood-soaked, covered in guts and gore for the sake of his people, before washing himself and dutifully and piously offering to the gods in the proper manner. His dark hair is also symbolic of his vicious method of fighting, backed by Ares, not Athena. His way of fighting is not supposed to be graceful and beautiful, connotations typically associated with blonde hair, but practical, savage, and grim. When Hector fights, it is not so much of a spectacle, but war-mad butchery. He does not fight war as an art, as Achilles, a warrior poet, does. Rather, he dispatches his foes without hesitation, often with cruel jabs and jibes at his opponents. While in terms of appearance, Eric Bana in the 2004 film Troy was excellent casting, Hector in the Iliad is not the goody two-shoes man who is always reluctant to fight. Hector is, with Ares at his side, consumed by the battle madness and killing instinct common in warriors throughout the ages, most famously associated with the Nordic berserkers, but still present in warriors even today. Achilles, meanwhile, is the opposite. While it not only creates a striking visual having the two greatest champions of their people having opposite appearances, Achilles is also very different to Hector in the sense of the personality of the two. Achilles is given bright golden hair because he glows a light like fire. The Greek word for blonde, xanthos, is also applied to bright light, often translated as blazing. His blonde hair is supposed to evoke connotations of fire, wrath and rage and beauty. His hair gives connotations of youth, grace, and beauty even in combat. He is motivated by burning rage. His skill and swiftness is unmatched. Similarly, Menelaus' name is thought to mean wrath of the people, and he too moves with burning rage and is a very skilled combatant in his own right. If any of you have played Total War Troy, their depiction of Menelaus is absolutely magnificent. Those with blonde hair are portrayed as being more emotional, more beautiful, more dangerous, and more difficult to control, much like fire. Menelaus, after all, is moved by the guilt of the ceaseless death of his men on his own behalf to challenge Paris to single combat, and even attempts to take Trojan warriors alive when the opportunity reveals itself, his attempts at mercy thwarted by Agamemnon, who butchers the prisoners in front of him instead, warning him against showing mercy. And again, his status as the younger brother is conveyed through his blonde hair, which even today is regarded as a sign of youth. Blonde hair was also, presumably, far less common in Bronze Age Greece, as well as in classical Greece when the poems were being recounted. These would give the heroes a very singular appearance, both Achilles and Menelaus being royalty, and would have had them standing out. We see similar occurrences with Alexander the Great, descendant of Achilles, having a very singular appearance that carried an aura of elevation. It's worthy of note here, before anyone accuses me of Nordicism or projection or something ridiculous, that I myself am very dark-haired, and I'm merely delving into the contextual perceptions and poetic nature of the descriptions of these heroes. These heroes are often not described in terms of their physical features and attributes, so for all we know, every single Trojan might have been blonde or brown-haired besides Hector, every Achaean red or black-haired besides Achilles and Menelaus. It's all complete speculation that ultimately doesn't mean anything. But the reason these characters are specifically described as having these traits is because Homer was using them for a reason. The next motif we're going to get into is that of combat, specifically that of archers and their seemingly universal bad moral character. The view of archery, at least outside of the context of hunting, has always been that it is a somewhat cowardly, less manly and noble way of fighting. We see this also in slingers and any other group that focuses on ranged combat. Even artillery in the modern day is viewed as somehow not being real soldiery, especially when the artillery belongs to the enemy. The Spartans, during one of their many wars against Athens, quite famously refused to acknowledge their own defeat, as the Athenians had relied on archers, and therefore not even really fought, at least in the eyes of the Spartans. The idea of putting other men in danger without facing such danger yourself is seen as dishonourable. It's seen as the mark of a man who doesn't dare to face his enemies, who shirks from meeting his betters on the field of battle. Throughout the Iliad, many of the men who rely on archery as their main form of combat are detested by both allies and enemies alike. Paris and Ajax the Lesser are clear examples, the one always shirking from honourable combat, not even earning the respect of his captive bride Helen, the other turning against his kinsman, and eventually forcing himself on a Trojan princess at the very feet of Athena's statue. Odysseus is another great example. Despite rather famously having a bow that only he could string and fire, Odysseus never uses it in combat, leaving it at home. Coupled with his boar tusk helmet, an iconic piece of Mycenaean war gear, it's quite clear that this bow is for hunting alone, not warfare. The next motif is one that occurs all throughout the Iliad, and that is of animals and animalistic behaviour. There are two aspects to this motif, two reasons for using it, both of which we will elaborate on. The first is that it's an interesting poetic device. There's only so many ways that you could write "and the two men fought until one of them died." Of course, the Iliad is far more poetic and interesting than that, but poetic devices like similes have to be used in order to keep things interesting and dynamic. It's also worth remembering the animals mentioned, such as great beasts preying upon sheep, were very real threats that ancient people had to contend with. Modern society has severed us from nature in many ways, not least from dangerous animals. Describing the men butchering one another like animals would not only create a frame of reference for those who had never seen battle, but also make it seem far more real, conjuring up images and fears of real dangers faced by many living at the time. The second, and far more complicated reason, is that warfare can reduce men to animalistic behaviour, and inevitably forces the warrior to rely on his instincts, for better or worse. This is something I elaborated on in my poem It Was Only Us, which some of you may have heard or read, but to summarise the point, warfare creates an environment in which you can never truly, completely relax. You don't know when you'll next get to sleep, when you'll next get to eat or drink, and death and danger can find you at any time. You can be killed by something you never even saw coming. You have to be ready to face death not only at a moment's notice, but after weeks of struggling in squalid conditions eating scraps just to survive. In other words, it forces you to live the same way that all animals in the natural world do on a daily basis. This realization came to me when I was sat in a trench being fired on by artillery and noticed that none of the wild creatures around us were frightened. Birds were still chirping and flying around, bees still buzzing, and beetles still crawling around in the mud. The danger didn't bother them, and why would it? A sudden and inconceivable death is something that the rest of nature is already used to. I personally have never felt closer to nature than when in war, and I believe that that in itself is a very ancient feeling, and why there are such prolific animal similes and metaphors throughout the Iliad. Age is going to be the next motif as we look into how Homer uses age and the expectations placed upon people of different ages in the same or similar environments. We see the youngest mere babes like Astyanax, and the youngest men taking up arms such as Antilochus, Diomedes, and even Achilles, whose young age is typically ignored in most depictions. Even the oldest age he's given at the time of his death is 30, meaning he had fought the long siege since the age of 20. Diomedes is the youngest of the Achaeans, having begun his career in war at the ripe old age of 14, and was also very young when the war began, believed to be around 19 at the beginning of the siege. It seems that at this time, the idea of young teenagers entering combat was, while rare enough to be notable, not rare enough to be unbelievable. However, just as hair colour is used as a visual expression of the character, age is also a malleable trait selected to fit the character and their role, rather than a consistent way of tracking the passage of time. Age doesn't really have a continuity in the Iliad. Men are young or middle-aged or old, Nestor having an abnormally long life even by modern standards, let alone those of a Bronze Age warrior. Rather, he's depicted as tremendously old because of his learned wisdom and experience, his time spent in the company of other older heroes. Meanwhile, the youth and vigour, the masculine beauty of other warriors is also hardly quantifiable. I think we all picture Paris as a youthful fool in his early 20s, Hector as his wiser, nobler older brother in his late 20s or early 30s, and Achilles as somewhere in between. But remember, the judgment of Paris, in which he chooses which goddess to give the apple of Hesperides to, inadvertently setting the stage for the Trojan War, takes place after the apple is given to the goddesses at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, Achilles' parents, who are yet to even conceive him. Paris is already a grown man, already married and divorced at least once before Achilles is even born. But ultimately, this inconsistency in the timeline doesn't change our perceptions. Paris, in his physical description and emotional state, never conjures up the image of a 40-odd-year-old man, which is about the age he would be if all the numbers added up. That would, I think, make him just beyond revulsion to the point of being too pathetic for anyone to even remotely sympathise with or even pity him. And it would make Hector seem like an old man past his prime, which is not the way in which he's even at all described. And for a prince to be in his late 40s by the time he has his first child is very, very strange indeed. So, once again, the ages of characters is a poetic device used for the purpose of expressing a point, not an exact frame of reference for timekeeping. The young men are, with the notable exception of Diomedes, all characterized as being somewhat more ruled by passions, be they those of savage butchery, lust for women, or occasionally even mercy. They're seen as generally more happy to indulge themselves, as well as displaying a somewhat paradoxical eagerness and readiness to spring into the fight with vim and vigour, and to lay back and do nothing. Then there's the old men who can no longer find the strength to pick up their weapons in defence of their home, having to leave the fighting instead to their sons and son-in-laws. Not only are their feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy apparent, in their fear as fathers having to send their sons into battle, but many of them have to watch their sons, that's sons plural, fall before their oncoming enemies, their entire house, their bloodline wiped out in a matter of moments. Everything they spent their life building now rendered meaningless, as there are now no younger generations to pass on their legacies to. They are often wise, having lived lives full of danger and difficulty, and give advice to their comrades and kings, but this often comes at a physical cost, and they would much rather be young than fighting once again. Old age was, in the Bronze Age, a very rare thing indeed. In some ways, it's used to counterbalance the choice of Achilles and show that living a long life and growing old is not necessarily all sunshine and roses. There are few old men who don't wish to return to their youth and take up arms, and coming to terms with the fact that your best days are behind you is a difficult thing, especially for those who have spent lifetimes at war and through luck and fate survived. Those few who could relate at the time would, I'm sure, find great comfort in hearing of these characters and knowing that they are not alone in their experiences. And the final motif that we're going to look at is that of mirroring, which, while it isn't as obvious, is a tremendously powerful device used throughout Homer's works. As stated previously, Homer's epic poems both establish two opposite points of view: the Achaeans and the Trojans in the case of the Iliad, Odysseus and Telemachus in the Odyssey. Their two narratives mirror one another until they are carefully interweaved, clashing into one another in a crescendo of violence and emotion. They use the idea of two things going on at once in similar ways on either sides, but use the differences in characters and motivations in order to garner different results. We're going to be delving into a few examples more in depth as we go through the series, as I don't want to end up front-loading all of the information all at once, or repeating myself as we come to the relevant passages in future episodes, but for now I'll give a couple of less obvious examples. At the same time, Paris and Achilles, whose fates are intertwined from before Achilles was even conceived until his death by Paris's hand, are both sat in their quarters, refusing to fight, coming into quarrels with their comrades and kinsmen because of issues caused by their emotions regarding their women. The difference between these very similar events is entirely down to the personality of the characters depicted, as, in keeping with the rest of the Iliad, the plot and the events it depicts are not complicated by any means, because the story is about the characters. The Iliad and Odyssey themselves are, in some ways, examples of this mirroring. One is a tale of a bloodbath that ends with grief and loss, the other is a tale of grief and loss that ends in a bloodbath. This combination of mirroring and contrasting happens so frequently in so many ways, some more subtle than others, that we will be here all day if I were to cover them all here in this video. So instead, it's going to be far more practical to point them out as we get to them, once the book-by-book analysis begins. And that about wraps it up for this episode. In the next one, we're going to be looking into the gods of the Iliad, the portrayal of them within, and how ancient Greek religion and conception of what divinity is informs Homer's poetry and expression, as well as how Homer's poetry and expression informs our modern conception of the Greek gods. Until next time.